In this lecture, we're going to start discussing the concept of species diversity and also what is the meaning of the term species. The species concept is fundamental in defining biodiversity. But what exactly do we mean by species? So there are different definitions of this concept. In recent years, taxonomists have introduced other characteristics as a means of differentiating species. So before, species were often defined in terms of the ability to breed and produce fertile offspring in nature. This biological species concept is based on the general idea of reproductive isolation. That is, organisms may be unable to breed because of physical characteristics, location, or habitat. This definition has some weakness, especially among plants and protists, many of which either reproduce asexually or regularly make fertile hybrids. Another definition about a species is the evolutionary species concept, which defines a species as a lineage of organisms that share a common ancestor and interbreed. We're going to use a very simple definition, that is that the species are a classification comprising related organisms that share common characteristics and are capable of interbreeding. Now that we have this concept, we can come up with the concept of species diversity. Species diversity describes the number of different kinds of organisms within individual communities or ecosystems. So these are all together the way that they exchange energy and materials. So this exchange of energy and materials is related to something that is called a species trait or organisms traits, which is how the organisms influence ecosystem processes. So the diversity of a species has functional consequences because the number and kinds of species present determine these traits. As I mentioned to you before, they mediate energy and material fluxes, and it can be directly or indirectly. Directly, for example, we have by limiting resources or disturbance in climate. But they can also do things that are more indirect that we are going to discuss. In addition to its effects on current functioning or ecosystems, species diversity influences the resilience and resistance of ecosystems to environmental change. So we will see that there will be some implications of losing this diversity or increasing this diversity. To understand what is species diversity, we're going to come up with two key concepts: species richness and species evenness. Richness refers to the number of species present, and species evenness refers to relative abundance. So the particular species presence or the species composition and the interactions among species and temporal and spatial variation in these properties determine the evenness. So how are they are distributed, how often they are present, and how they interact with each other. In general, it is known that the species richness affects ecosystems, the function of ecosystems. But how is this effect? Well, with the small experiments, scientists know that there is a direct correlation between species richness and the rates of ecosystem processes. But there is little known about this correlation in more complex ecosystems or at a bigger scale. But we know that there is a direct correlation, and we have some examples where we actually clearly see the importance of species richness. For example, microbial richness can lead to increase the composition of organic matter. So it means that if we have different variety of microorganisms, they can degrade or decompose the organic matter, being in a natural system or in a man-made system, in a more effective way than when we have only a few species. Now, to talk about species evenness or relative abundance, we're going to have this example. where we're going to have a clear distinction between the two concepts. The species richness in an environment is simply the number of species found in that environment, right? So in this case, we're showing two communities of trees, different trees, and they have the same number of individuals. That means that they will have the same species richness. But what about the evenness? Well, so in the terms of species evenness, community number 2 has a different less evenness as compared to community 1. The previous example shows a way to quantify in a very simple way biodiversity. But there are some other methods that are being used, such as the Shannon index or the Simpson index. These methods have some advantages and disadvantages. I'm going to just very quickly discuss the Simpson index. In this case, it takes into account both the number of species present, which is related to the richness, and the number of individuals per species, evenness. So so it takes into account the both things that we discussed in the previous example. And then a higher index value is given to the greater degree of biodiversity within the community. The Simpson reciprocal index can be used to compare communities to identify intrinsic qualities. A high index value suggests a stable site with many different richness and low competition. A low index value suggests a site with few potential niches where only a few species dominate. The method has some limitations because it considers a dominance index as it weights towards the abundance of the most common species. So it really does not consider the role of those species or the distribution, right? We're going to have an example of the Simpson index, so you can see what is the role of having different species and a different, let's call the abundance, right? So here we present again two communities. We have samples of the two communities who have different species. In total, we have 5 species, but they are not present with the same numbers and not even present in in each community. So there are differences in the number of species, but also in the species that are present. So in the sample 1 we have A, B, and C species, and in sample 2 we have A and D. And you can see that the most dominant species in the sample 1 is A, and then we have B and C with only one individual. And then we have in the second one, in the second community, we have A and D, but we have even numbers of these species. When we do the calculations based on the equation that we presented, we can see that community number 2 has a higher diversity index than community 1. So from this example, we can see already that there are some limitations with this index to estimate biodiversity. One is that species lose their identity, which means that we don't know really the role in the community, and there might be some species that are more important than others in terms of the functions that they perform. It does not consider difference among individuals of species, for example, age of the species or sex. And then also diversity indices are very sensitive to sample size and also a lack of probabilistic basis. Given the importance of biodiversity on the planetary boundaries and the connection with the human survival, researchers have come together to develop more advanced models that consider other aspects of biodiversity to estimate the impacts of changes in biodiversity. So Globio is a model that has been developed by a group of researchers from all over the world, and it calculates local terrestrial biodiversity intactness and is expressed by the mean species abundance, MSA. And it's a function of 6 human pressures: land use, road disturbance, fragmentation, hunting, atmospheric nitrogen deposition, and climate change. So the core of the model consists of quantitative pressure impact relationships that have been established based on extensive terrestrial biodiversity databases. This is an example of what are the results of this Globio model. In the figure, we have a map for 2000 and another baseline scenario for 2050. You can see that land use effects are dominant in these maps. So you can see that the impact on biodiversity is predominant due to this cause. And then also you can see that dryland ecosystems like grasslands and savanna will be particularly vulnerable to conversion over the next 50 years. Increasing effects of infrastructure are evident in Asia and Africa. And much of the world's remaining natural areas will consist of boreal, tundra, ice, mountains, and arid to semi-arid regions, all of which are generally considered less suitable for human settlements. So thanks to these models, the governments can have better policies implemented for the preservation of biodiversity, and actions can be taken to protect key areas and to have direction on how to protect the environment.